Meeting on the crossroads where the two forbidden subjects of religion and politics intersect. This is the Sophie Scholl Roundtable. I'm Mel McGinnis, and with me again is James Hagberg. I just so appreciate how he's so well studied with regard to issues related to China and as the former Soviet Union, Russia as well. So we didn't even cover something that I'm sure is going to be a greater issue after the Olympics are over. And that issue regards a little tiny island just off mainland China known as Taiwan. James, what do you think about that situation? Taiwan, mainland China, what do you think is transpiring there?
Well, effectively, the Taiwan situation, a lot of people don't seem to know this, but effectively what's most likely happening is going to be the end of an almost 100-year-long civil war that, for all intents and purposes, has ended. But the country of Taiwan is technically not the country of Taiwan. It is officially the Republic of China. As following the Second World War, China was mostly controlled by the Chinese nationalists, the Republic of China under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, our ally, the one that we had supported throughout the Second World War to combat the Japanese. Following the Second World War, the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong had effectively been handed, not only did they control much of the rural regions in the northwest, they had also been pretty much handed over Manchuria and the east by the Soviets after they invaded. And the civil war between the nationalists and the communists continued almost immediately. And the United States made an agreement with the Soviet Union to effectively stay out of the conflict, that we would not support the nationalists and they would not support the communists, mostly because we had no intention of getting involved in a land war in Asia. The Soviet Union blatantly, although they agreed to not support the communists, they blatantly violated the treaty and sent millions of guns, trucks, ammunition to support the Chinese communists. Towards the Civil War continued on, and towards the end of it, the nationalists were eventually driven off the mainland, where they retreated to the island of Taiwan, which had been taken back, which had been under Japanese occupation since the first Sino-Japanese War. And effectively, that's where they remained. And there was, for quite some time, the threat of a communist invasion was very high. And it could have very easily gone the way that the communists would have invaded Taiwan. And it wasn't until the Korean War, when the United States had to take a second look at our policies in the East regarding the expansion of communism, that we decided that we were going to extend our protection not just from Korea, but over the nationalists in Taiwan. And we've effectively stopped the Chinese communists from making any advancements on Taiwan since. Since then, relations have effectively fairly normalized between Taiwan and China. Economically, Taiwan is very much supported by the Chinese, and I believe that when the time comes, the first thing the Chinese communists will do will be, the invasion will most likely not be through military force, but through economy. Because the Chinese communists have a massive, just like they have everywhere.
Yeah.
Just as they've been expanding their economic influence, especially in the West, in the United States, they also have a lot of vested economic power in Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that an invasion of Taiwan is necessarily near. I think it's possible, depending on how the West continues to react to the aggression of the dictators in Russia and China. I think if we continue to show weakness and the willingness to appease aggression, as our current president has, I think that it's very possible that we could see an invasion, but I think most likely, so long as China believes the United States will intervene, I don't believe there's going to be a physical invasion.
So they'll do it economically, like you said. And what was interesting, you said China's influence on Taiwan is similar to what they've been doing in the West, as if Taiwan's a microcosm of what we see occurring in the West.
Yeah, because Chinese influence, for the most part, they've based, I believe, they have been spending an exorbitant amount on their military, and they've been expanding almost every single field. At the moment, they still don't have the technology or the capability of competing with the United States. In an all-out war, there's effectively no way for the Chinese to win against the United States. And so what they can do is seize on the growing lack of innovation by the United States, and our willingness to stand idle as our economy continues to effectively free fall. And the Chinese have no problem of just picking up after that, because following the Second World War, the United States was effectively handed the world. Because the rest of the planet had spent the last 5 to 7 to 8 years of shooting itself. Half the world was either subservient to a foreign empire or was lying in rubble. But the United States had been completely untouched. We already had a strong economy, and we had a whole world that was looking somewhere for salvation economically. And they all came to the United States.
Yeah.
And as the rest of the world has continued to modernize, advance, and reindustrialize, the United States has lost that power and that influence. And the fact that there hasn't been a major global conflict in which the United States has had to go in and protect our allies. I mean, most conflicts have been fairly small, regional, and mostly for political reasons. We haven't had that need to innovate our economy nearly as much. And while the Chinese have spent this entire time building their economy to use that against us, they're going to pick up the pieces that we leave behind.
Pieces such as?
I would say the biggest thing would be just production of... The Chinese started early on, one of the first plans of the CCP was to effectively take on to become the factory of the world. For so long, we always associated goods made in China with cheap plastic garbage.
Yep.
It's the little plastic container that breaks, or the toy that probably cost 1 cent to produce that they sell you for $2. It's all made in China. And for a long time, because China had such a massive population, that the first thing they wanted to do was to raise as many people out of poverty as possible, to industrialize as many people as quickly, which is what they did. Chinese industrialization didn't happen because of some masterful planning by the Central Politburo. It wasn't because the CCP was the ones who got state-planned economies right where the Soviet Union and other communist nations failed. It's because they were smart enough to realize that they had to open up and allow Western-style capitalism, not exactly free market, because the last thing they want is free market or a free space to develop individual ideas. But to allow foreign capital to freely flow into China and allow the West to effectively build China for them. To allow the corporations to come in, set up factories, which will raise the standard of living for the average Chinese, which has completely legitimized the communist government.
Yeah.
The world praises the Chinese communists for what they've done. Effectively, what they did was they weren't idiots. They were smart enough to look at the Soviet Union and other failed state-planned economies and decided, let's not do that. Let's do at least the basics of what every other free society and other dictatorships. Because there have been plenty of dictatorships that have implied economic capitalism, like the Nazis and the fascist Italians and the Chinese.
Right.
Those were all horrible, oppressive dictatorships, but they all employed a form of corporatism, which helped build their economies. And so the Chinese simply decided they were going to model themselves after that. and they allowed the West to do effectively the rest. And now they're in a position where they can begin to use that power and move on to producing other things.
Yeah, so it's like they, in a sense, did the planning and let the West do the heavy lifting.
In many senses, yes.
And they really benefit off of it.
Extremely.
Wow. Yeah. As we've been talking, I couldn't help but thinking the last time we mentioned it, you mentioned TikTok. And I just feel like this is an insidious form of how a nation can use technology against another. Meaning, you're saying TikTok over in China, kids will be watching, learn how to become like an engineer or things that have to do with productivity, using hands and minds in a useful way. Whereas in the West, like you said, you come up with this stupid little dance and you've got everybody's attention. To me, we're seeing a difference in approach to technology. One to entertain merely, and the other for a purpose of building.
Yes, and because I believe that's what the Chinese have designed the different algorithms and different servers to do.
Yeah,
the algorithm that Chinese servers would be using for the app are very different from the ones we see in the West. That it will promote these different nonsensical and completely the morally degenerate acts that people will do to see a number of views go up when it's completely meaningless and produces nothing for society.
Right. Oh, I just thought that was a very sharp point to make, to see how technology, what it's doing to us in the U.S. and what it's doing for them over there. And, by the time I think we will wrap our time up here, I go back to the Olympics, and I feel like this is the first Olympics I've never watched. It's like I didn't even know they were on. And I think it goes back to the aspect of there's a line that was crossed. Meaning civil rights abuses, human rights abuses, the Uyghur people, and even Voice of the Martyrs put out communique saying, please pray for the Chinese Christians that are there. And like I say, with the Uyghurs, we really don't know exactly what is happening. We hear about them being used as slave laborers. We heard the term of them being put in a form of concentration camps, but we really don't know what's going on. Although, didn't the Chinese communists pull a public relations ploy by using one of the Uyghur people in a prominent way for the opening ceremonies?
They did. One of the Chinese athlete that had the honor of lighting the Olympic flame was a Uyghur athlete. And something I found when I've been looking at this was I started to read and watch a few things. The many similarities to what the Chinese communists have been doing, it really echoes back to how Nazi Germany used one of the first Olympics, the Olympics of 1936,
right.
The 36 Olympics that were held in Berlin. How Hitler used it as as a way to show the world the success of National Socialism and the success of the Nazi Party and all that they had accomplished in revitalizing the German spirit.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways that's what China has been attempting to do today in using the Olympics now. And in a way, the West has made the same mistakes because we were even before the war, many people were aware of the gross and horrendous conditions that were being forced upon the Jewish population in Germany. Mm-hmm. Even though the final solution, the concentration camps weren't in full effect at that point.
Right.
The Nuremberg laws and other legislation that had specifically targeted Jews, everyone was aware that Hitler was a dictator and a tyrant. and the West continued to endorse him anyway. Many called him a master diplomat, and the West praised Hitler like many in the modern West continue to praise China. And one of the things that really angers me is the fact that I was speaking with some friends at work, and they weren't even aware of what was going on in the Xinjiang region of China, northwestern China, and the Uyghur Muslims.
Yeah.
There are so many people that seemingly just don't care that there is effectively a modern genocide, a modern Holocaust happening right now. And it's not just happening in China. There are dictators from Kim Jong-un and the dictators in Iran and Iraq. It's the hypocrisy of what's been going on in the modern American media, how they will continue to demonize the West and Western culture and values and claim that America is a system of oppression. Why can't you be more like China? Is what seems to happen all of the time, that they'll prop up China as, well, look at that. They industrialized their country so well, even though it was done on the back of the United States and half of our economy was shifted over to the Chinese. But the fact that the people have no freedom of speech, they can't complain about the systematic oppression of the Uyghurs.
Yeah, it's like J.A. Adonde, who's a guest on Pardon the Interruption on ESPN. I guess he's a professor, too, at Northwestern University. I'm not sure about that. But he says, basically, we're as bad as China. Look at our voting rights violations. And I'm thinking, you're making an equivalency of the USA to communist China? It's like these guys who are in these institutions of education are making these kinds of comparisons, which are way off the mark. But, as you brought up in the last century, the media was way off the mark about Hitler.
Yeah, they have been way off the mark of lots of dictators. They did the same thing. They praised the Mussolini and the fascist Italians. And there was, especially during the Second World War, there was a growing sentiment of camaraderie with the Soviet Union. There was a lot of propaganda aimed at trying to promote the socialist models in the Soviet Union as a success.
Yes, and the vehicle to do that was the New York Times with Durante. I forget the guy's first name, but Durante was the reporter, writing these glowing reports about what was happening in the Ukraine and dismissing the genocide of the Ukrainian people during that Soviet takeover of that land. So, I find these conversations with James to be so invigorating, and I appreciate how he, as a young man, is not spending his time watching TikTok, but is really digging into what's happening in the world, and he speaks so intelligently about it. James, thank you so much for coming in. Do you have a last word you want to say? Something I didn't cover that you'd like to have added before we wrap it up here today?
I guess the only thing I'd say about the impending Chinese takeover of the world, I believe the only way it's going to happen is if the United States continues to let it happen. If America and the people of America continue to ignore the expansion of the Chinese Communist Party, if we continue to see them as nothing more than, well, yeah, there's some human right, they're questioning about their human rights, but it's not our problem. It doesn't matter. If you're more interested in doing a stupid dance and getting a bunch of people to look at you, or dressing provocatively and walking down the street and you'll get a bunch of thumbs up, it doesn't mean anything and it doesn't produce anything for society. Effectively, we're going to have an entire generation of people who have no interest of actually working and bettering the rest of society, and their only interest in getting as many people to like them as possible. And the Chinese are the exact opposite. And I believe if we continued on this path, we are going to hand the world over to China. They are not going to take it from us. We are simply going to drop it into their lap.
Wow.
And I only can pray that things can change.
That is a terrific summation, a word of warning, certainly a prophetic way of stating it. James, thanks again for being on the Sophie Scholl Roundtable.